In the flood narrative recorded in Genesis chapter 7 verse 16, there is a brief statement that most readers overlook without hesitation. It says, "And the Lord shut him in." In a story filled with catastrophic rain, rising waters, the collapse of the ancient world, and the preservation of a single family, this quiet sentence carries enormous theological weight. Noah did not close the door. His sons did not seal it. No angel is mentioned. The Lord himself shut the door of the ark. That single act reshapes how we understand divine judgment, divine protection, covenant, human helplessness, and salvation. To grasp why this moment changes everything, we must step into the world before the flood, examine ancient Mesopotamian parallels, explore Hebrew language nuances, study rabbinic interpretation, and consider how early Jewish and Christian thinkers understood this act of God personally sealing Noah inside the vessel that would carry humanity into a new world, the violence that reached heaven. The flood narrative does not begin with rain. It begins with moral collapse so severe that it is described as reaching the very presence of God. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5 declares that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The language is absolute. It does not say most people were corrupt. It does not say society has declined somewhat. It portrays a civilization whose inner life had become saturated with destructive intent. The Hebrew term translated as imagination refers to the shaping or forming of thought, suggesting that corruption was not merely behavioral but conceptual. Evil was being engineered in the human mind before it ever reached the streets. Ancient Jewish commentators later reflected that this meant violence had become normalized, even justified. What had once shocked the conscience no longer disturbed it. Humanity has redefined right and wrong according to appetite and power. Genesis chapter 6 verse 11 adds another layer, stating that the earth was corrupt in God's sight and filled with violence. The Hebrew word for violence is chamas, a term that conveys ruthless injustice, bloodshed, exploitation, and oppression. It appears elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures to describe societal brutality that cries out for divine intervention. This was not private immorality hidden behind closed doors. It was systemic. The entire social structure had become predatory. When ancient rabbis commented on this passage in Genesis Rabbah, compiled in its written form around the 5th century CE but preserving earlier traditions, they suggested that theft had become so widespread that people stole amounts just below prosecutable limits. The law technically functioned, but morality had collapsed. Corruption hid behind legality. Society still appeared organized, yet it was hollow at its core. To understand how this would have sounded to the earliest hearers, we must place it within the ancient Near Eastern world. Civilizations in Mesopotamia began flourishing around circa 3500 BCE, with cities like Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Kish emerging as centers of trade, religion, and political power. Archaeological excavations at Uruk reveal monumental temples and complex administrative systems. Yet ancient inscriptions also reveal intense warfare between city-states, forced labor, and rigid hierarchies that favored elites. Power was centralized in kings who claimed divine mandate. The Sumerian king list, preserved in copies dating to circa 1800 BCE though reflecting older traditions, records long reigns before a catastrophic flood interrupted history. Even outside the Hebrew tradition, memory lingered of a world swept away after an age of corruption. The biblical account, however, gives moral clarity to that destruction. It was not random. It was not divine rivalry. It was a response to violence that had saturated human society. Genesis chapter 6 verse 6 introduces one of the most startling statements in the entire Hebrew Bible. It says that the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This is a deeply emotional language. The Hebrew verb translated as regretted can also mean to be sorrowful or to be moved to pity. Ancient Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, writing between circa 20 BCE to 50 CE, argued that such expressions do not imply divine instability, but are accommodations to human understanding. God does not experience regret as humans do, Philo explained, but Scripture uses relational language so that readers grasp the seriousness of the moment. The grief described here signals that humanity's corruption had violated the very purpose of creation described in Genesis chapter 1, where humanity was declared good and made in the image of God. The concept of the image of God intensifies the tragedy. In the ancient Near East, kings were often described as images of a deity, representing divine authority on earth. The Hebrew narrative democratizes this concept by declaring in Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 that all humanity bears God's image. Therefore, violence against another human being was not merely social injustice. It was an assault on divine representation. The corruption described in Genesis chapter 6 becomes cosmic rebellion. When the text says the earth was filled with violence, it suggests that the divine image was being systematically desecrated through oppression and bloodshed. The grief of God reflects not wounded pride, but violated purpose. Ancient flood traditions from Mesopotamia, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh preserved in Akkadian tablets discovered in Nineveh in 1853, describe a flood sent because humanity had become noisy and disruptive to the gods. The contrast with Genesis is profound. In the Hebrew account, the problem is not inconvenience to heaven, but injustice on earth. The flood is framed as moral reckoning. Scholars such as George Smith, who first translated portions of the Gilgamesh flood tablet in 1872, noted both similarities and stark differences between the accounts. The biblical narrative stands apart in its emphasis on ethical corruption as the cause of judgment. This difference reveals a worldview in which God is not capricious but morally engaged. Amid this universal decay, one figure stands in contrast. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 introduces Noah as a righteous man, blameless in his generation, who walked with God. The Hebrew word for righteous is tzaddik, indicating conformity to divine standards. The phrase blameless does not imply sinless perfection, but integrity within a corrupt age. The expression walked with God echoes the description of Enoch in Genesis chapter 5 verse 24, suggesting relational closeness. In a civilization collapsing under violence, Noah's life represented resistance. His righteousness was not isolation from society, but fidelity within it. The darkness of his generation magnifies the significance of his obedience. Before a single drop of rain fell, before a single plank of wood was assembled, the story establishes the central tension. A world consumed by violence stands under impending judgment, and one man finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. The ark in a world that refused to listen. When God speaks to Noah in Genesis chapter 6 verse 13, the announcement is direct and without ambiguity. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. This is not a warning of partial reform. It is a declaration of total judgment. Yet immediately following the decree of destruction comes a command of preservation. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 14, God instructs Noah to make an ark of gopher wood, specifying rooms within it and commanding that it be covered inside and outside with pitch. The level of architectural detail is striking. Genesis chapter 6 verse 15 provides exact dimensions: 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height. Using a standard cubit of approximately 18 inches, the ark would measure about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This would make it longer than a modern football field and large enough to contain enormous volume. The structure is not elegant. It is not described as a ship with sails or a keel. It is a massive floating vessel designed for endurance rather than navigation. In the ancient world, boat building was common along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Reliefs from Assyria and Babylonia depict reed boats and wooden vessels used for trade and warfare. Yet nothing on record from that era matches the scale described in Genesis. The ark's proportions, interestingly, align with modern principles of stability in rough waters. Naval engineers in recent centuries have observed that a vessel with similar ratios would be highly resistant to capsizing. This detail has led some researchers, such as the 20th century scholar John Whitcomb, to argue that the design reflects functional realism rather than mythic imagination. Regardless of modern debate, the narrative presents the ark not as symbolic decoration but as a practical instrument of survival. Construction would not have been immediate. Genesis chapter 6 verse 3 refers to 120 years, which many interpreters through Jewish and Christian history have understood as the period before judgment fell. Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing around 93 CE in his work Antiquities of the Jews, stated that Noah attempted to persuade his contemporaries to change their ways while building the ark. According to Josephus, the people dismissed him, regarding his warnings as madness. Though the Genesis text itself does not record Noah preaching extended sermons, the New Testament in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 later refers to Noah as a preacher of righteousness. This suggests that his obedience was accompanied by verbal warning. Imagine the cultural setting. In a region likely resembling ancient Mesopotamia, where agriculture depended on seasonal river flooding but not on global catastrophe, the construction of a colossal vessel far from any ocean would have appeared irrational. Urban societies valued productivity, trade, and military strength. A man investing decades into building a massive enclosed structure based on divine instruction would have seemed disconnected from reality. The ark stood as a physical contradiction to prevailing assumptions about stability. Its growing frame testified that Noah believed something unseen was coming. Every beam raised was a declaration that divine judgment was certain, even if clouds were absent. Comparisons with Mesopotamian flood stories deepen this context. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is warned secretly by the god Ea to dismantle his house and build a boat. The instructions describe a cube-shaped vessel, equal in height and width. The gods in that story are divided and act out of frustration with humanity's noise. By contrast, Genesis presents a unified divine will grounded in moral reasoning. The ark is not a secret escape from quarrelsome deities. It is a transparent act of covenantal preservation. This distinction would have been profound for ancient Israelite listeners familiar with regional myths. The God of Genesis does not act out of irritation but out of justice and purpose. Genesis chapter 6 verse 18 introduces the word covenant for the first time in Scripture. But I will establish my covenant with you. Before rain falls, before the ark is completed, God promises relationship and continuity. In ancient Near Eastern practice, covenants were binding agreements often sealed with ritual and sacrifice. Hittite treaties from circa 1500 BCE to 1200 BCE show formalized language establishing loyalty between king and vassal. The Genesis covenant differs in that it is initiated entirely by God. Noah is not negotiating terms. He is receiving a promise. The ark becomes the physical expression of that covenant. It is the container of divine faithfulness amid universal collapse. As the structure rose year after year, society likely continued its routines. Markets opened, fields were ploughed, marriages were celebrated, violence persisted. The absence of immediate judgment often reinforces disbelief. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 verse 11, written many centuries later, observes that when a sentence against evil is not executed speedily, the human heart is fully set to do evil. That principle would have applied in Noah's generation. The long delay between warning and fulfillment tested faith on both sides. For the corrupt world, it emboldened denial. For Noah, it demanded endurance. By the time Genesis chapter 7 begins, the ark stands complete. Animals begin entering in pairs, male and female, as commanded in Genesis chapter 7 verse 9. The text presents this as orderly obedience rather than chaotic scrambling. 7 days before the flood, according to Genesis chapter 7 verse 4, God announces the final countdown. This 7-day period mirrors the rhythm of creation in Genesis chapter 1, where 7 days structured the birth of the world. Now 7 days precede its unmaking. The stage is set. Humanity has ignored warnings. The ark is ready. Yet one decisive act remains undone. The door still stands open, the day heaven closed the door. Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 gives a precise chronological marker that anchors the flood in lived time rather than vague legend. It states that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. This specificity is striking. Ancient myths rarely anchor events in personal age and calendar detail. Here, the narrative slows down to record the exact day judgment began. According to traditional Hebrew reckoning preserved in Seder Olam Rabbah, a Jewish chronological work compiled in the 2nd century CE, this event occurred in the year 1656, from creation. Whether one accepts that calculation literally or symbolically, the point is clear. The flood is presented not as metaphor but as history. For 7 days prior, Noah and his family had entered the ark as commanded in Genesis chapter 7 verse 7. The animals had come in ordered pairs. The door remained open during that final week. Jewish tradition suggests that during those 7 days, Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, died at the age of 969 years, as recorded in Genesis chapter 5 verse 27. Some rabbinic commentators believe the 7-day delay was a period of mourning, showing that even in judgment, God honored righteousness. Whether symbolic or literal, the pause underscores divine patience. Then the rain began. Genesis chapter 7 verse 12 says the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, but the rain itself is only part of the catastrophe. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, people understood the earth as resting above vast subterranean waters. The Hebrew phrase suggests tectonic upheaval, not mere rainfall. The collapse of the old world came from above and below. The windows of heaven opened. The deep burst forth. The stable order described in Genesis chapter 1 seemed to unravel, and then comes the quiet sentence in Genesis chapter 7 verse 16. After listing Noah, his wife, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives entering the ark, the text states, "And the Lord shut him in." The Hebrew verb used is sagar, meaning to shut, enclose, or secure. It is a deliberate act. Noah did not pull the door closed himself. He did not secure the pitch. He did not hammer the final plank. The Lord shut him in. The same God who pronounced judgment personally ensured protection. This moment carries enormous theological weight. Up until this point, Noah had acted in obedience. He built, he gathered, he entered, but he did not seal. The final separation between life and death was not entrusted to human strength. It was performed by divine hand. In ancient covenant ceremonies, sealing symbolized ratification. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia were enclosed and sealed with cylinder seals to guarantee authenticity. When the Lord shut Noah in, it signified that the covenant promise of Genesis chapter 6 verse 18 was now secured. Imagine the sound, the rising wind, the distant thunder, the first heavy drops striking wood. Perhaps voices outside still dismissed the danger, but when God sealed the door, opportunity ended. The dividing line between mercy and judgment became fixed. From that moment forward, survival was not about Noah's engineering skill. It was about divine enclosure. Waters that erased a world. Once the Lord shut Noah inside the ark, the narrative shifts from warning to fulfillment. Genesis chapter 7 verse 17 states that the flood was upon the earth 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose high above the earth. The image is both terrifying and controlled. The same waters that symbolized chaos in ancient thought now became the instrument of divine judgment. In the creation account of Genesis chapter 1, God separated the waters above from the waters below, establishing order from chaos. Now that order collapses. The boundaries that once restrained the deep are removed. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven open. The stable world that humanity depended upon begins to dissolve. Genesis chapter 7 verse 19 intensifies the scene by declaring that the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The language is universal and sweeping. Whether read as global catastrophe or as ancient phenomenological description of total destruction within the human horizon, the message is clear. Nothing outside the ark survives. The phrase "under the whole heaven" reflects the worldview of the ancient narrator. To those experiencing the event, every visible refuge disappeared beneath rising water. Civilization, agriculture, architecture, memory, and achievement were swallowed. The waters prevailed for 150 days according to Genesis chapter 7 verse 24. This was not a passing storm. It was a prolonged uncreation. Archaeological excavations in southern Mesopotamia have revealed thick flood deposits at sites such as Shuruppak and with sediment layers suggesting massive inundation events around circa 2900 BCE. Sir Leonard Woolley, during his excavations at between 1922 and 1934, described a deep layer of clean silt separating two distinct periods of occupation. While scholars debate whether these layers correspond to the biblical flood, they confirm that catastrophic flooding was part of ancient memory. For communities living along major rivers, water was life and death. The biblical narrative captures that fear and magnifies it to cosmic scale. Outside the ark, chaos reigned. Inside, a different reality prevailed. Genesis chapter 8 verse 1 states that God remembered Noah and every living thing with him in the ark. In Hebrew thought, when God remembers, it does not imply prior forgetfulness. It signals covenantal action. The same God who shut Noah in now actively sustains him. The sealed door meant that no matter how violently waves battered the hull, the boundary between judgment and mercy remained intact. Noah's safety was not the result of superior strength. It was the result of divine promise. Ancient Jewish interpreters imagined the psychological weight of those days. The ark had no steering mechanism. It had no sail. It drifted upon uncontrollable waters. For 150 days, there was no visible land, no horizon of stability. Yet the sealing of the door meant that uncertainty outside did not penetrate within. The act of God closing the ark transformed it from a wooden structure into a sanctuary. It became the only preserved fragment of the old creation. Theologically, this period represents a return to primordial waters. Before land emerged in Genesis chapter 1 verse 9, water covered everything. The flood reverses creation temporarily. Then, slowly, God begins again. Genesis chapter 8 verse 3 records that the waters return from off the earth continually. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. The specific date mirrors the earlier precise dating of the flood's beginning. Time is measured carefully, as if to say that even in catastrophe, history remains under divine governance. When the ark settled upon Ararat, located in the region later known as Urartu in eastern Anatolia, referenced in Assyrian inscriptions from the 9th century BCE, it signaled that judgment had reached its limit. The sealed door had preserved life through the peak of destruction. Now, as waters receded, the stage was set for covenant renewal. The world that emerged would not be identical to the one that perished. Genesis chapter 8 verse 22 records God's declaration that while the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The rhythm of stability is re-established, but none of it would have occurred if the Lord had not first shut Noah in. That quiet act ensured that when the old world dissolved, a remnant remained to inherit the new, the covenant that emerged from the waters. When the ark finally came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month, as recorded in Genesis chapter 8 verse 4, the world outside was silent. The waters had dominated for months. According to Genesis chapter 7 verse 11, the flood began in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day. Genesis chapter 8 traces the slow retreat of the waters over the course of nearly a full year. By the time Noah, his family, and the animals left the ark in Genesis chapter 8 verse 14, it was the 601st year of Noah's life. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the narrative carefully marks time, reinforcing that this was not a brief disaster, but a prolonged reshaping of the earth. The sealing of the door had preserved them through an entire cycle of seasons, through darkness, waiting, and uncertainty. The mountains of Ararat correspond to the region of ancient Urartu, located in what is now eastern Turkey near the borders of Armenia and Iran. Assyrian records from the reign of King Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BCE refer to this mountainous territory. By situating the ark's resting place in a real geographical region known to ancient readers, the text anchors the event in the world of recognizable history. This is not an unnamed mythical peak hidden in fantasy. It is a region associated with known peoples and kingdoms. For early Israelite audiences hearing or reading Genesis, Ararat would have represented a distant but real northern landscape. When Noah finally stepped onto dry ground, his first recorded action in Genesis chapter 8 verse 20 was not building shelter or surveying damage. He built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings from clean animals. This act is crucial. Before planting vineyards or organizing livestock, Noah acknowledges the source of his survival. The man who had been sealed inside by divine hand responds with worship. Ancient Near Eastern covenants often included sacrifice as a sign of binding agreement. Hittite treaties dating from circa 1500 BCE to 1200 BCE show ritual offerings, accompanying formal commitments. In Genesis, however, God initiates the covenant, and Noah responds in gratitude rather than negotiation. Genesis chapter 8 verse 21 records that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and declared in his heart that he would never again curse the ground because of man, even though the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. This statement is astonishing. Human nature has not fundamentally changed. The flood did not erase the inclination towards sin, yet God chooses restraint. The sealed door preserved humanity not because humanity had become perfect, but because God determined to sustain creation despite human weakness. The covenant that follows in Genesis chapter 9 extends beyond Noah to his descendants and to every living creature. It is universal in scope. In Genesis chapter 9 verse 12 to Genesis chapter 9 verse 13, God sets the rainbow in the cloud as a sign of the covenant between himself and the earth. The Hebrew word keshet can also mean bow, as in a weapon of war. Some ancient Jewish commentators understood this imagery symbolically, suggesting that God placed his war bow in the sky pointed away from the earth, signifying peace. Whether or not that was the original intent, the image communicates divine self-limitation. The same God who unleashed the waters now promises stability. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter will continue as long as the earth remains, as declared in Genesis chapter 8 verse 22. The sealing of the ark foreshadows this covenant. By personally shutting Noah inside, God guaranteed that the line of humanity would continue. From Noah's sons Shem, Ham and Japheth would come the nations listed in Genesis chapter 10. From Shem's line, according to Genesis chapter 11, would come Abram, later called Abraham, around circa 2000 BCE in the region of Ur of the Chaldeans. The covenant with Noah therefore becomes the foundation for all later biblical covenants. Without the sealed ark, there would be no Abrahamic promise, no Sinai covenant, no Davidic kingdom. The entire unfolding of biblical history depends upon that moment when God enclosed a family within wood and pitch. Early Christian writers recognize this connection. In the 1st century CE, the author of 1 Peter, chapter 3, verse 20, explicitly refers to 8 persons being saved through water and draws a parallel between the ark and later themes of salvation. Church Father Irenaeus, writing around 180 CE, described the ark as a type or foreshadowing of divine deliverance. He emphasized that the safety of those inside was not accidental but ordained. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century CE, reflected that Noah's deliverance demonstrated grace operating within judgment. These interpretations reveal that the sealed door was never viewed as a minor logistical detail. It was understood as a theological declaration. The covenant after the flood confirms what the sealing already implied. Judgment does not have the final word. The God who grieved over human violence in Genesis chapter 6 does not abandon creation. He restrains wrath, establishes promise, and binds himself to the future of the world. The rainbow in the sky becomes a reminder not only of past destruction, but of enduring mercy. Yet all of it traces back to that decisive act when the Lord shut Noah in, drawing a line between a world that was passing away and a world that was about to begin again. The detail that changes everything. The phrase, "and the Lord shut him in Genesis chapter 7 verse 16, is brief, yet it carries enormous weight. In a narrative filled with overwhelming catastrophe, rising waters, and the collapse of civilizations, this single detail shifts the focus from human effort to divine sovereignty. Prior to this moment, Noah had labored diligently for decades, gathering animals, building the massive ark, and obeying God's commands. His actions demonstrated faith, diligence, and moral integrity. Yet the ultimate act that ensured his survival was not the result of human endeavor. It was God himself who enacted the decisive measure. The sealing of the door symbolizes that salvation is initiated and completed by God. This is not a passive promise. It is an active, sovereign intervention in the world, ensuring that the righteous are preserved even when surrounding circumstances are chaotic. Theologically, the sealing serves multiple purposes. First, it underscores human dependence upon divine initiative. No amount of skill, ingenuity, or foresight could have secured the ark against the rising floodwaters without God's action. By personally shutting the door, God demonstrates that deliverance is ultimately a gift, not an achievement. This idea resonates throughout Scripture, prefiguring later theological concepts such as grace and divine protection. In Jewish thought, the Midrash emphasizes that the world was given opportunities to repent, but God's protective act for Noah and his family illustrates that mercy and judgment operate on a divine timetable. Human action matters, but it is insufficient on its own. Second, the sealing of the ark represents covenantal commitment. In the ancient Near East, contracts and agreements were frequently sealed with symbolic acts such as clay tablets impressed with cylinder seals. This act ensured the agreement was binding and irreversible. By analogy, God's action in Genesis chapter 7 verse 16 functions as a divine ratification of the covenant promise given earlier in Genesis chapter 6 verse 18. The ark is more than a vessel of survival. It is a physical manifestation of God's promise. The survival of Noah and all living creatures aboard signifies that divine protection is guaranteed when God declares it so. The sealed door is therefore both practical and symbolic. Practical because it physically prevents intrusion, symbolic because it demonstrates the certainty of God's commitment to preserving life. Third, the moment carries narrative and typological significance. The ark, sealed by God, prefigures later biblical themes of salvation through divine intervention. In the New Testament, the Apostle Peter draws a parallel between the 8 persons saved in the ark and salvation through baptism in 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 20. Early Christian thinkers such as Irenaeus and Augustine viewed the ark as a type of Christ and the sealed door as a demonstration that God controls access to salvation. Just as the ark protected the righteous from the flood, divine intervention in Christ provides spiritual protection for those who respond in faith. The sealing emphasizes that salvation is not merely about human effort or ethical conduct. It is about entering into the sphere of God's preserving action. Finally, the detail transforms the flood narrative into a story of hope amid judgment. The waters outside the ark were overwhelming, covering all mountains under the whole heaven, according to Genesis chapter 7 verse 19. Yet inside the sealed vessel, life continued. Every species, every person, every living creature aboard the ark was preserved. This distinction highlights the principle that divine protection is both absolute and precise. The world outside continues to reflect chaos, corruption, and destruction, but inside, God's promise is fully realized. The sealing demonstrates that even in the face of universal catastrophe, God can guarantee deliverance for those aligned with His will. Throughout biblical history, this moment continues to resonate. The same God who shut Noah in is the God who rescues the faithful, as seen in the deliverances of Israel from Egypt, from the Babylonian exile, and ultimately in salvation history through Christ. The narrative teaches that divine action is decisive, irrevocable, and protective. Human obedience matters, but it is effective only in conjunction with God's initiative. The sealed ark becomes both a historical moment and a theological lens through which all divine intervention can be understood. It is not simply a story of survival. It is a story of God asserting sovereignty, executing judgment, and offering mercy simultaneously. In sum, the sealing of Noah inside the ark is more than a narrative detail. It is the hinge upon which the entire flood account turns. Without it, survival is uncertain, the covenant is unratified, and the theological message is muted. With it, the story conveys divine control, human dependence, covenantal promise, and the assurance that even in the most cataclysmic moments, God's protection and purpose prevail. It changes everything because it frames the flood not merely as an event of destruction, but as a deliberate act of salvation. The sealed door is the first clear line of demarcation between judgment and mercy, between chaos and covenant, and between the old world and the new creation that emerges after the waters recede.